Chicago, and Professor of Surgery and Neurology at Lerner College of Medicine at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. Dr. Flechner has authored more than 220 scientific papers, review articles, and book chapters. He is famous worldwide, not only in the United States, and he is associate editor of Journal of Clinical Transplantation and editorial board member in Journal of Transplantation. We welcome you to Mansoura. To my best knowledge, this is your second visit to the center, and we hope for future mutual work together. Professor Shukir and Professor Anwar will chair this session. Welcome, Professor Flechner.
Good afternoon. We are going to start this afternoon session by a lecture Immunosuppression, Renal Transplantation, past, present, and future.
Well, thank you very much, and certainly thank you for that lovely introduction. I think my mother must have written it and sent me the expression. Dr. Shoher, Dr. Anwar, thank you again for the lovely invitation. This is a rather wide or large subject, and I thought what I would do is a way to perhaps discuss this for those who are involved or with care of transplantations, or those who are not, or just to give you some background about why we do what we do. Sometimes it's understandable and based on evidence, and other times it's a little bit just based on experience and how we've evolved. Advance just as we on the computer. Okay. So let's talk about the past, the present, and the future, what we mean by that. The past and how we got there, how we developed some of the thought processes and practices that we do. Well, what we can say is transplantation has been around about 60 years, but the longest surviving transplant recipients were in the late 50s, and these were actually the third successful transplants done. The first successful human transplants were done in Boston in 1954, and they were between identical twins. And it was well known based on Medawar's work and Billingham and Brent from the late 40s and 50s that there was a process of rejection, and rejection would occur. So that's why the first transplants were in identical twins. And these sisters both did very well. The recipient actually had a few children in her life. But they were the sort of ideal. They were the best outcomes because being identical twins, they had very minimal, if any, alloimmune activity. But what was interesting to me is if you actually look at what was known about identical twin transplants, there were about 120 done in the United States and 10, 12 done in England. And what's fascinating is how many of these patients were on immunosuppression. So many of them were thought to be on nothing, but a lot of them were on low-dose prednisone or azathioprine and some of the other agents. And the reason is many of them were transplanted with autoimmune disease, glomerulonephritis, and the types of diseases that could occur. So what was important, I think, was the idea that not just rejection, but there are other reasons why grafts can fail. And if you look, this really isn't so great, is it? Graft survival is about 90% at 5 years. That's a big number, but you would think it would be virtually 100%. But there is some graft loss in HLA identicals as well. Now, this kind of summarizes, I think, immunosuppression from the beginning to where we are today. And the early proponents and practice of immunosuppression began with a very, very distorted arena here, where 90% of patients experience acute rejection, and survival was less than 50% at a year. Now, this was generally just using what we now would consider minimal medication. But the target for 30, 40, 50 years has been this, acute rejection. So we now are in a current environment where greater than 90% of grafts function at a year and acute rejection rates of 10 to 15%. Now there's a price to be paid for that, and I'll go into that more with you, but we have been quite successful in going from this terrible early start to where we are today. So let me give you what I consider what we've learned. There are three bedrock principles of transplant immunosuppression. And it's not surprising what I'm going to tell you. It's what was learned in preclinical studies in the laboratory and then was reproduced in humans. And the first principle is that alloimmunity follows the same rules as the immune response to other microbes and foreign invaders. And the ability to identify self from non-self, specificity, memory, amplification, these are all principles of the immune response, and they work directly the same versus an allograft. Whether it's a heart, kidney, liver, etc., it doesn't matter. The same thing goes on. The second bedrock principle is something we clinically borrowed really from our friends in oncology. And that is that the cell cycle of a lymphocyte responds to immunosuppressive drugs like a cancer cell to chemotherapy. And what that principle means is one immunosuppressive agent may be very, very potent, and you can give enough of it to prevent rejection, but it's generally too toxic for a patient to sustain. So in, let's say, transitional cell cancer, we can kill all transitional cell cancer with a platinum agent, cisplatin. But in order to do that, sometimes the dosing would have to be so high of platinum that it would be too toxic for the patient to withstand. So that conceptually, if we use lower doses of drugs that attack different points of the cell cycle, then this can be, in a sense, synergistically put together to make a regimen or a cocktail that's quite effective. And the third bedrock principle of immunosuppression that I think we've all learned is that clinical immunosuppression is a careful balance between too much and not enough. And you can't say it any differently. Either you're giving someone too much or you're giving the person not enough. They have not enough, too little. They can experience rejection or recurrent disease of autoimmune disease. If you give them too much, they experience opportunistic or routine infections and cancer. And we don't really have a specific number. I can't tell you that that particular patient or that particular organ needs that much immunosuppression. It's an overall amount. So that putting these all together, we have kind of rules or principles that we go by when we practice. One is that it's important to prevent a primary immune response, and that no acute rejection is better than some rejection. It's better to use just what I said, lower doses of multiple immunosuppressive drugs that work at different points of the cell cycle. It improves tolerability and toxicity. And that the total amount of immunosuppression should be decreased over time as the host accommodates the foreign HLA phenotypes. And that's a learned experience over decades. Sorry for this very busy slide, just to make a principal point, that we target the immune response, or I call it different points in the cell cycle, by the initial presentation of cells. Ultimately, after proliferation and sensitization occurs, the two signals, signal one and co-stimulation, we then get stimulation of naive, or activation rather, naive T cells that turn into activated cells that produce cytokines, and these cytokines feed back on other clones of activated cells to expand the arrangement. So there's amplification. So this whole busy slide is just telling you there are always opportunities for new agents to come along that can target different points in the cycle. So what we're left with, perhaps in a more simplistic way, but in a practical way, with immunosuppression is we deliver it in three different strategies. The first strategy is to deliver what we use the term induction therapy. It's to give high-dose therapy to prevent a primary immune response. We do this to knock out immune activated cells, decrease so-called passenger leukocytes that come with the graft that are allostimulatory, and then permit resolution of ischemic injury in the case of the kidney. Maintenance therapy is what most patients take every day. It's the lowest dose tolerated therapy to prevent rejection. We want to, of course, minimize it, minimize toxicity, minimize side effects. And then lastly, we have to come up with different regimens to treat rejection if it occurs by boosting the immunosuppression delivered either with biological products or oral agents or combinations thereof. So that's what we've learned really over 50 years, and how we apply this, I think, varies. Different parts of the world, different practitioners, although all these themes come into play. So in the present, and this is data from North America, obviously I'm showing you North American data, I don't have specific national data in the Middle East or Egypt, but I think the principles are the same and the findings are the same. We have a terrible imbalance in the total number of people waiting for a transplant and how many we do. In the United States, we've done about 16,000 to 17,000 transplants for 10 years. Interestingly, we don't really do more. We're at a point where we capture just about the most deceased donor organs we can, and then we waste some or we discard some. That's an opportunity to improve, but we don't get more. And we haven't had a big increase in the number of live donor donors. They've actually dropped a little bit, but perhaps now with this notion, we can talk later about this pair exchange, we may be able to do some more. But this is kind of this terrible imbalance we have. And there's an active mortality on the wait list. It's about 6 to 7%. People sometimes forget that. So patients that wait for an organ have a mortality. They're really suffering when they don't get transplanted. So what about transplant outcomes? We've all come to establish sort of benchmarks about what outcome is, and we talk often about what the rejection rate is in a year, and then what is graft survival at 1 year. And since the results are quite good, they're over 90%, we sometimes get a little bit mentally lazy about this, or think that we're doing such a good job. But the reality is there's quite a steep loss of grafts that begins at about 5 years. Even from 1 to 5 years, we lose a good number of grafts. But by 10 years, less than half of the deceased donor kidneys are working, and only about 60% of the live donor kidneys. So that's a pretty steep rate of loss if you consider the only alternative to that is that patients have to go back on dialysis or get another transplant. Now, one of the sad realities, and this is not related to the folks here, but you can see what play it has, is sometimes how insurance coverage gets very involved and how medical care is delivered. So the United States can quite unproudly say that they have 10% worse graft survival than Canada, Europe, and the United States, and the United Kingdom. You can see that there's a cluster here about 80% at 5 years and about 60% high 50s, and yet the United States is worse. And we think one of the driving forces of that, why it's worse, is most of the patients who are on government health insurance only get immunosuppression paid for 3 years. They don't after 3 years. So patients have problems. They have problems paying for medications. It can become expensive and lead to drop-off. And clearly that impacts these long-term outcomes. So immunosuppression is required long-term, and it's something that we really need to consider. The second thing we've become better at is learning in a predictive kind of way that the donor kidney of itself has an intrinsic outcome predictability or risk. We now have numerized this, and we call it the Kidney Donor Profile Index. But there are 10 features that one can assign to a specific organ donor that will relate cumulatively to impact outcomes, so that these 10 characteristics, age, height, weight, BMI, ethnicity, hypertension, diabetes, etc., you can see here, are telling us, or we can enumerate a number we call the profile index. So if you have a number, that number tells you that during the prior year, that many percent of organs survive better than the organ you've got. So if your KDPI is 90, they're saying last year 89% of the kidneys work better than my 90%, and then I'm getting this. And this is a real impact on outcome. Look at this range. 94% is the best, the lowest KDPI, 0, down to under 80, 78%. So that's like a 16% difference in graft survival just based on the characteristics of the graft. So older organs from those who had prior pathology, hypertension, diabetes, injury that led to higher creatinine, etc. That will give you less survival of the kidney post-op. And I think that's an important factor because what we try to do is give these higher KDPI kidneys now to basically older recipients who have a shorter life expectancy. You wouldn't want to give a KDPI of 99 to, let's say, a 20-year-old. I mean, you could, but that wouldn't be a good use of the organ. What we've developed are certain practice patterns, and what I'm going to then show you after these next two slides is how we got there today and why people are treated with what they're treated. If you look in the United States, today about nearly 60% of patients get an induction antibody, and the most common antibody is the depleting antibody, globulin. About 20 to 25% get another antibody, either a non-depleting antibody called basiliximab or another depleter called alemtuzumab. The total is about 80-85% of patients get an antibody, only about 15% or so don't. And that's been pretty consistent the last, this bracket here when this pattern came in about the last 5 years or so. It's pretty common. One of the leading, and I'll mention this, reasons to use these antibodies is to diminish the dose of steroids as well. In terms of maintenance therapy, this also has been sort of by trial and error consistently modeled out. And most of the centers put patients on tacrolimus and a derivative of mycophenolic acid, either mycophenolate mofetil or mycophenolic acid itself. And that figure is well over 90%. About under 10, 8% or so are on an mTOR inhibitor. And more and more, there was a big increase in the number of patients that were steroid-free off steroids. It's dipped up a little bit. The issue with steroids sort of waxes and wanes in attractiveness, but at least 70% or more of patients wind up on steroids. So how did we get there? Well, I'm going to show you several studies that sort of led to some of these conclusions. One simple question, why would we use induction therapy? What I mentioned is high-dose therapy, usually with an antibody to deplete or not deplete, does block the activity of early naive T cells. Why do we do that? Well, this is a registry study that was published using our SRTR registry, comparing about 20,000 or so patients with no antibody, 70,000 with an antibody, 10,000 with a depleting antibody. And this occurred in like 10, 15 years ago data, so it hasn't really been updated, but every quick look at it, it's about the same. And the important point is there's a lower rate of acute rejection and a lower rate of graft failure when patients are given an antibody. And I think this is fairly borne out all over the world. So it's created this sort of indelible practice pattern. Unless someone is an HLA identical sibling or very well matched, usually there's a tendency not to use a depleting or non-depleting antibody. So the second question is, why depleting, why not depleting antibody? There's some downstream side effects for the depleting antibodies in terms of more profound T cell depletion, therefore more viral infection. So there's sort of a reason not to use a depleting antibody if you don't have to. But this is data from a very well performed multi-center randomized trial in patients that were high risk for either delayed graft function or rejection. And these were donors that had a long cold ischemia time over 24 hours, age over 50, deceased donor that was either cardiac death, an elevated creatinine, or recipients that were retransplanted, had a high degree of sensitization, or African American. And they were randomized to receive thymoglobulin or basically depleting and non-depleting antibodies. And the outcomes were a bit different. Those who were given the depleting antibody, again in these high-risk fallen kidneys, had a much higher rate, a 10% greater rate of acute rejection, and a greater rate of steroid-resistant rejection. But just as we would also predict, they had a higher rate of viral infections post. So if one is dealing with more of a deceased donor kidney with any kind of these high KDPI or risk factors, a depleting antibody is clearly the way to go, which is why it's done. Lastly, what about maintenance immunosuppression? And, you know, many of us for years have been doing studies comparing agents one way or the other. I think this is the study that sort of triggered the current practice patterns. This was a study called Symphony. It was a multi-center randomized trial, extremely large, 1,600 patients were in it, 400 in each arm. All of the patients got a non-depleting antibody, and this study was funded by the Roche company who made CellCept, mycophenolate mofetil. So all the patients got full dose 2 grams of MMF, and they were compared to the so-called full dose cyclosporin, low dose cyclosporin, low dose tacrolimus, or low dose sirolimus. And the driving outcome that changed practice, I think, is clearly the TAC group, low dose TAC, so to speak, had the lowest acute rejection rate. Now, frankly, I was interested in and spent a lot of time, actually, as did Dr. Abdul-Backer, studying sirolimus, and they used very, very low levels. That's subtherapeutic. Patients, the first 3 months, you have levels of 10 to 15 nanograms per ml. So they used low-dose therapy, which I think drove this high acute rejection rate, unfortunately. But I think that study was the one that triggered and laid the pattern for what we're doing. Okay, so if that's what we're doing, why do we still lose grafts? And this is another area of intense interest and study, and there's no exact answer. They're just really fairly consistent observations. We lose grafts really for 2 reasons. Either the patient dies with a functioning graft, or they develop chronic scarring of the kidney. We give it different names, CAN or chronic allograft nephropathy. They develop antibodies to their disparate HLA phenotypes, or they become non-adherent. All of these lead to scarring of the graft. Usually acute rejection is a very uncommon reason to suddenly lose a kidney. And why do these people die? Well, they die with the consequences generally of cardiovascular disease. Infection used to be the largest cause of death, but not anymore. We do a better job of prophylaxing. And cardiovascular disease is our big problem. Why? Well, we're transplanting more older patients, a lot more diabetics, and a lot more patients with inherent cardiovascular disease, atherosclerotic, peripheral vascular disease, central disease, coronary disease, and they're just getting morbidity related to that. They're not really dying at a rate greater than the general population with this degree of pathology, but that is ultimately the primary cause of why grafts fail. Patients die with grafts. So the enemy here, instead of acute rejection, is this. It's a chronically scarred graft. What does that mean? There's interstitial fibrosis. If I showed you a trichrome stain, this would be all blue. Atrophy is severe, the tubules. Eventually, there's injury to the glomeruli, and they develop so-called transplant glomerulopathy. which is both seen on light as a double contouring of the glomerular basement membrane. One can see this even worse on EM. And then the blood vessels themselves are targets with arteriolar hyaline deposits and vasculopathic proliferation. So basically, the blood is squeezed out of the kidney, it gets inflamed, and it gets replaced with fibrosis. And one can see this in many different diseases, but in the view of the transplanted kidney, this is the end of the kidney. This is how it's failed. So we know from a lot of different studies and registries and associations, there are many ways to get to this. But the one we worry about the most are the alloimmune responses that are driven to cause this. And then in particular, the development late in the course of the graft of donor-specific anti-HLA-P antibodies. Nephrotoxic drugs is a big concern, especially the calcineurin inhibitors, poorly controlled, basically metabolic syndrome, diabetes, obesity, dyslipidemia, hypertension, etc. And I'll do this as well as size. Coupled with this phenomenon was the important observation made several years ago that there's a clear distinction between those patients that develop anti-HLA antibodies, so-called DSA, donor-specific antibodies, compared to those that don't. And biopsies were taken of kidneys, I believe, for 7 years, out, and then patients were broken into groups based on the presence or absence of donor-specific antibodies, and if there was manifestation of these antibodies, which is the release of the C4D complement fragment in the biopsies over time. And as you can see, the worst combinations were those that developed antibodies and had C4D deposition. A very striking difference in just 2 years between those that had no antibodies and no C4D. So clearly, late-stage antibody formation is one of the key triggers of failing grafts at the end. The second point that couples with this is once you see transplant glomerulopathy in a kidney on a biopsy, sort of the clock is started. And if you look at, this is a study from the Mayo Clinic, if you looked at patients that had transplant glomerulopathy with C4D deposition, look how fast you are, terrible runoff, more than half the grafts. From that point, you lose them in 2 years or less. So that antibody formation, scarring of the kidney, transplant glomerulopathy, these are the reasons we lose grafts. So what's been tried with immunosuppression? What do we try to do as new agents come on board? We suffer through these. These are the side effects of all the immunosuppressive drugs. And they more or less affect different people at different points in time after the transplant. Some of the agents induce dyslipidemia, some induce hypertension. Of course, the calcineurin inhibitors notoriously cause pre-glomerular vasoconstriction and diminished blood flow to kidneys, leading to nephrotoxicity. And then some specific things like gingival hyperplasia or wound healing problems. So we mix and match to try to minimize these side effects. And then if one patient is suffering through a group of these side effects, we sometimes switch drugs to try to eliminate them. And it leads us, I think, to going forward, or in the current area, there are really 3 approaches to try to minimize these toxicities. One is to try to minimize steroids. We can drop them off early or late, before or after 3 months after the transplant. We can actually try to do CNI, calcineurin inhibitor-free protocols with other agents, or we can try to combine them both, do steroid-free and calcineurin-free protocols. And the idea is that by eliminating these 2 drugs primarily, many of the side effects can be diminished and theoretically improve compliance for patients. Why minimize steroids? Well, I don't need to tell everybody who studied the medicine. We basically cause Cushing's disease by giving patients higher dose steroids. I must say, when I first started out in transplantation, we used to keep patients on 10 milligrams a day of prednisone, and then 7.5. And we make about 7.5 milligrams a day, about 37.5 milligrams of hydrocortisone in the adrenals. So that, I think, is kind of the cutoff. Today, we generally treat patients long-term with 5 milligrams of prednisone. And I must say, these side effects like this are very, very unusual. So we have sort of come to this logical conclusion is you can get to a lower threshold of safety with steroids. So what about not using steroids? Well, I think there are two very well done trials that showed you what the effect of steroid-free immunosuppression is. This was a trial called the Freedom Study, done in both North America and Europe. It was a one-year trial where 336 primary adult recipients were randomized either to never get steroids at all, to get steroid reduction at about a week, 500 down to 20 milligrams, and then compare them to standard steroid taking therapy with maintenance doses of 500 milligrams. And the one-year outcomes were quite good in terms of patient and graft survival, but those with the lowest steroids had the greatest number of rejection episodes, 30% to 14%. Not, I guess, surprising. Moreover, those with the highest steroid doses had the best renal function, and the reason is they had lower rejection rates, so rejection persecution. So this kind of a very well thought out and shown outcome is telling you what you'd expect. You're going to get lower rates of diabetes when you don't take steroids. You're going to get more rejection and worse kidney function. How you balance that out in your practice is, choice and how you manage patients. Now, the flip side of this was the argument that tacrolimus is a more potent drug than cyclosporin. So why should we not try to use tacrolimus if we're going to be steroid-free? Well, the answer comes from this very well done randomized controlled trial. Steve Woodall was the author. This was done in North America. And the key thing I liked about this study, we participated in this, was that the patients didn't know what they were getting. They got a sugar pill, so to speak, placebo, or they got the steroid. So all the patients got a depleting antibody. They all got tacrolimus and mycophenolate mofetil, and they either did or didn't get steroids. And the outcomes were impressive. The survivals were good, and it was cumulative 5-year data. This was a 5-year study, and they didn't break the blind until 5 years. And the outcomes appear here. The price to pay for not being on steroids, twice the rate, roughly 19 versus 11% of acute rejection. And interestingly, no big advantage of steroid-free versus 5 milligrams a day in terms of diabetes, although there were fewer leg fractures. So there you go. Take 5 milligrams of prednisone a day or don't. If you're going to take none, you have a greater chance of rejection, but perhaps you have less avascular necrosis. But either way, I think the outcomes were quite similar, and you can see what the inherent advantages or disadvantages are. So about 2000, a new class of agents came out called the TOR inhibitors, a molecular target of rapamycin. The initial drug is sirolimus. Trade name is Rapamune. There's a newer agent, everolimus. The trade name is Zortrex, made by Anwar. And the first look into the use of this drug occurred with a study where patients were given both cyclosporin and sirolimus, and then had the cyclosporin discontinued at 3 months. This was the so-called RMR study. And this was, I think, the first clear evidence that withdrawing a calcineurin inhibitor completely led to increased GFR, better renal function. And this study was carried out over 4 years, close to 5 years, and this difference in renal function was maintained. The survival was also better in the patients, and this seemed to be an advantage. Now, there was some criticism in this because patients entered only by surviving 3 months. So of course, all the bad actors got knocked out early, and this was really a better actor, so to speak, survival study. But then again, it is showing you this interesting effect on removing calcineurin inhibitors. So this led to another concept of why don't we just give everyone the calcineurin inhibitor a while and then stop? And the trouble sometimes when you enroll patients in large studies or try to get large studies is you have to bend a little bit on the entry criteria. So this was a very important study called the convert study, and why I like this a lot was all the patients had a kidney biopsy at the point of entry into the study. And the design here was patients were going to stop their calcineurin inhibitor and switch to the TOR inhibitor, sirolimus. A huge number of patients, really 800 were entered. They were all adults. But the problem I think we had in this was that look how wide the window of entry was, 6 to 120. What's 120 months? 10 years. So we were swapping or switching patients very late in their course. They could be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years out. I know the mean, I think the mean was only about 2-3 years, but still the window here was very, very large. And what you see by having such a large window is how many of the patients had very scarred kidneys. So here, 20% of, this is a BAMF grade 2, that means 26 to 50% of the kidney has interstitial fibrosis and tubular atrophy. Grade 3 is more than 50%. A third, really, of all these patients had badly, badly scarred kidneys. And the net effect of this study, there really only was a positive impact for those patients that had very good GFRs, well, relatively, I wouldn't say very good, but relatively good GFRs, over 40. The group that you'd want the best result on are the ones that had low GFRs, 20 to 40. You'd want them to see if you get more renal function improvement, and unfortunately, there was not much of a difference. They didn't do any better. So the conclusion was a meaningful increase in GFR of 5 to 10 cc's a minute was only seen with those with a GFR over 40 and no protein in the urine. And again, that's not the group you really would have wanted to target, but that's what the outcome was. And it was showing us that if you switched people late when so many were scarred, you weren't going to get a good outcome. Then during the decade of the 2000, 2010, a whole bunch of trials were set up to try to go CNI-free. Initially with the concept of using sirolimus and Imuran and then sirolimus and mycophenolate. The results were pretty decent, but a high rejection rate. So then this whole pool of studies were put together using an induction antibody with sirolimus and MMF. And some of the studies were done here in Mansoura. This is Dr. Hamza and Dr. study. And what you can safely show here is that in a controlled population where you would keep the trough levels of sirolimus adequate, you can get very good outcomes, excellent graft survival, and 10-15% relatively low acute rejection rates. The trouble is when this was put forth more widespread, some of the side effects from the TOR inhibitors got to be problematic. Dyslipidemia, wound healing, acne, and then people would switch it back and forth and lower the dose, and there was a lot of dissatisfaction, which was caused, I think, by that symptom study that I showed you earlier, where low dose is just simply inadequate. So we then embarked on a large multi-center randomized trial to try to answer this question with tacrolimus. This was the so-called Orion study. That was done in 3 arms where all the patients got a depleting antibody, and then one group was given sirolimus, tacrolimus, where the tacrolimus was discontinued in 3 months, the CNI-free arm, sirolimus and MMF, and then the control arm, tacrolimus and MMF. And all of these patients, the vast majority, had steroids. And this was carried through for 2 years. But with some disappointment, what happened again was there was a higher rate of acute rejection in the sirolimus arm rather than the early CNI withdrawal or the late continuation of CNI. And what happened, and the reason I believe this happened, even though on the patients who stayed on the sirolimus had better renal function and better outcomes, was the practitioners, so-called investigators were underdosing the sirolimus. So if you looked at the patients that rejected, nearly all of them had subtherapeutic doses, meaning less than 10 to 15 nanograms per mil. There was nothing you could do about it. The data was already collected and patients were already treated. So if you want to look at the reality, the water half full, water half empty, so to speak, this was not a satisfying study because the rejection rate was higher. The last component of this effort to minimize or eliminate calcineurin inhibitors came from the so-called switch studies, and there were 3 of them. 3 were randomized and 2 were de novo. The concept study was done in France, and Zeus, as it's called, was primarily done in the Germanic countries, and STN, spare the nephron, was done in primarily in the United States. And the idea here was picking a point in time of patients who were on calcineurin inhibitor and sirolimus, stopping calcineurin inhibitor and starting the sirolimus. And as you can see, that was done at 3, 1, and 1, 6, 4, 5 months in these windows. And the outcomes, I think, in general, were pretty good here. Renal function was better. The percent rate of acute rejection was not particularly different between any of these groups. And the delta GFR was 5 to 7, 5 to 8 cc's per minute better. So there was improved GFR with no increase in rejection and tolerability discrepancies that were pretty similar in all these 3 groups. And I would tell you, at my center, this is a lot of what we do still. We do this with swapping patients after wound healing is occurred and patients are stable. Okay, what about the future? So current practice is what current practice is. And I would say we've learned a lot over the years, but I think this is one of the more disappointing things to say as a practitioner of kidney transplantation. And the reason is this. Take me a minute to explain this, but there have only been 2 new agents that have come across in the last few years that have been, at least for the American and the European registering agencies that get very involved with drug production. And that is everolimus, which is the BID derivative drug of sirolimus that is produced by the largest company, and this new fascinating drug, Nulogix, velocacid, which is a post-stimulatory blocker. Each of them, I should tell you, have very low penetration in the overall market. We're talking 10%, something like that. One of the big reasons is they are new drugs and they are very expensive. And the drugs used now, more commonly, are all generic and they're very cheap. And the insurance companies don't want to pay for them. And unless you're a part of a study or you're wealthy, it's very, very tough getting these drugs. Below the line is something to make a research scientist and a clinical researcher in transplantation literally cry. And this is a long list of new agents. Many of them are potent. Many of them are immunosuppressive. And many of them would have a role in transplantation. And nearly all of them have been killed off in phase 1 or 2. And I'll explain to you why at the end. My good friend Flavio Vincenti now considers this, that new drug research and transplantation is a graveyard. It's where new drugs go to die. And it's been very, very disappointing. The real reason this is occurring is the market is small. There's thousands, 50,000 patients in the entire world get a transplant, or something like that. Multiple sclerosis, psoriasis, GI inflammatory disease, millions and millions of patients have this. So the new pharmacy coda is if the FDA and the regulatory structures are going to make it so difficult to get a drug, and people are going to run to lawyers and sue everybody if they get side effects, we're only going to make drugs for this big market where we're going to produce a lot and sell a lot and have an ability to control side effects because we're only giving one drug at a time to a patient, unlike our patients in transplant that go home with a whole big bag full of different, 10 different medications. So we can talk a little bit more about this, but the current production is become a serious problem. But let me be a little bit optimistic because I think eventually things will get worked out. Belotasib is a fascinating drug. It was based really on a theory. And the theory is if you block signal 2 that I showed you before, the CD28, B7, 1 and 2, co-stimulatory ligands, you can cause anergy. You prevent an immune response. So signal 1, which is the presence of a disparate HLA polypeptide presented to the T cell receptor of a lymphocyte, that's the signal that needs to start triggering a naive lymphocyte. But if you don't have signal 2 engaged, that lymphocyte will die, go into anergy. Where you need signal 2 to get proliferation after its activation. And by blocking signal 2, you block the immune response. And that is eminently true in small rodent animals, in monkeys, primates, and now we know humans. So there were 2 significant trials undertaken by the BMS company to produce this drug. One was called Benefit. It was a trial basically where patients got the basiliximab induction, and then they were given the belotasib with MMF steroids, no third drug, no calcineurin inhibitor drug, and it was compared to cyclosporin, methylprednisolone, and mycophenolate mofetil. A second trial was put forth called Extend, and this was just in those type of patients at high risk for delayed graft function, but the modeling of drug delivery was the same. And the outcomes were quite similar. What was interesting is that the acute rejection was actually the highest in the belotasib and lowest in the cyclosporin, but the renal function was better at every time point, which is really, really interesting, and the first time this has been shown. And just to prove this was convincing and true, the patients were studied out as long as 7 years. And this difference in GFR persists between those who are calcineurin free and those who are on the calcineurin inhibitor. The other thing to point out that's fascinating about belotasib is it's a fusion antibody molecule. It needs to be delivered intravenously, and patients only take it once a month. There's a very long half-life. So it's potentially thought to increase adherence because you only take it once a month. You don't have to take the pill, another pill every day. This has been pushed forward a little bit to even a further concept that I think may be true, and that is using belotasib with sirolimus in a way to diminish all calcineurin inhibitors and from the get-go, from de novo. So this was a shorter-term study. Only 100 patients or so were entered, and all these patients got thymoglobulin induction. They were then put on either tacrolimus and MMF with no steroids, belotasib and MMF and no steroids, and then belotasib and sirolimus. Now, for those who don't actually use these agents, sirolimus is a drug taken once a day, and belotasib you take once a month. Now that is a very dramatic improvement in somebody's life. You just take 1 pill a day, and once a month you get a shot. Not like taking 10 pills a day multiple times a day. The outcomes here were quite good. The best renal function were again in the CNI-free arm, and the lowest acute rejection rate was in the CNI-free arm with belotasib and sirolimus. So I think this is something that could be done. It was pushed one step further by a group in Duke, Alan Kirk, who's the editor of AJT, American Journal of Transplantation. And what they did is give a depleting antibody, alemtuzumab, and sirolimus with belotasib, and then stop the sirolimus in a year. So I think when I got this data from him, there were 20 patients, and I think 2 of them, I guess, were completely, 2 were completely weaned off, weren't taking anything. So, I think people have wanted to look at these parameters and see if they can do it. The last thing I'll close with quickly is an agent I was involved with, which was a IgM monoclonal antibody that blocked the T cell receptor. IgM antibodies are rarely used in transplantation, They do have, at times, a shorter half-life, but this may be desirable in the case of induction therapy. So the agent's called Tol-101. It binds directly to the T-cell receptor, the alpha chain of the T-cell receptor. It's non-mitogenic, and it doesn't cause, even though it was a xenoantibody, a murine xenoantibody, it doesn't cause an anti-mouse response. And it worked in a similar way to something older called anti-CD3 or OAP3, which bound to the CD3 model. The point is, this was a non-depleting antibody that completely knocked out cells, so the ones that have T-cell receptors. So you may recall about 95% of the circulating cells are alpha-beta T-cells, alpha-beta T-cell receptors, and gamma-delta T-cells are about 5%. So by knocking out these alpha-beta cells, the gamma-delta cells are not very immunosuppressive. Matter of fact, they're thought to be tolerogenic. So long story short, we titrated at doses, had a good dose regimen about what to give, and show that we can knock out T-cells for about 3 weeks, which is what you would want, and then you get recovery. But the drug is stuck because of an insufficient amount of funds to run a large randomized trial to the FDA. Frankly, most of the pharma companies have not been interested in it or buying it because the market's small. So the problems with developing new immunosuppressive drugs I've alluded to, that there's very high research and development costs today. There's a limited market share. The intensity of regulation is unbelievable. You almost need lawyers to do this. And the actual unmet needs today are not that clearly defined. Sure, you can want 5 or 10 cc's more GFR, a few people, percent of people with less acne or whatever side effect you want to pick. But it's very hard to convince large-scale agencies that this is important. There's a very narrow window of immunosuppression between too much and not enough, as I showed you. Delivery needs to be easy. Side effects need to be minimal. Short and long-term effects need to be known. Everyone wants to know what's the 10-year survival of this or that. And that's during the first 2 weeks you're using something. It's very hard to do. And then, of course, what is the net effect of this giving less immunosuppression, less drugs? Companies are not selling more product, they're selling less product. And then, and I put this here in my own view, I don't think anyone in pharma would ever tell you this, but there's a real risk that transplant problems can kill a drug. And it did happen with something called Raptiva, we could talk about it later. It was a psoriasis drug used in kidneys, and then it led to a couple of patients that got PMLs in the head, leukoencephalopathies, tumors in the head, and then the whole drug got killed. So I think the pharma markets know about this and they're very against it. So let me conclude this long wave on the sea that I've showed you and tell you, I think, what we've learned and what we can try to do. I think both immunologic and non-immunologic stressors affect long-term allograft function. Death with a functioning graft and chronic allograft nephropathy remain the dominant causes of late graft loss. Steroid avoidance protocols are increasingly being utilized, but definitive advantages are not easily demonstrated. The best maintenance immunosuppressive combination or steroid-free strategy is a work in progress. Everyone's still looking for it and awaits longer-term follow-up. By avoiding toxicities of current agents, new drugs with novel mechanisms of action may offer improved long-term outcome. But we're certainly going to have to convince regulatory agencies and the pharma industries that this is our goal. And I think we need almost like one of these war projects, war on cancer, war on this. We need a war on new transplant drugs to try to get prevent the blockage, really, of the development as it goes. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.